Okay, I'm Dr. Hollern, and I work with online chiropractic marketing systems. And specifically, what I do is I have coaching, training, and marketing systems to help chiropractors really maximize their chiropractic practice. And really, the reason for that is not only to help a lot of people, but really so they can enjoy the lifestyle they dreamed of and really pursue their passions and their dreams. I've opened 77 chiropractic offices in 20 states, seeing over 30,000 new patients a year, over 600,000 patient visits. Been a speaker in 3 chiropractic colleges and donated over $500,000 to chiropractic. So that's a little bit about my background. And the topic we're going to cover today is a really massive topic. It has to do with success and failure. And so I'm just going to share with you what I've studied and learned to help give the results that I just talked about. And so let's go ahead and just kind of jump in here, some of the factors that we're looking at. And when we look at a business, whether it's a chiropractic business or any other type of business, I've always, when I step back and looked at it, I always said, if you had to say 3 things in general that why people weren't at another level, I've generally found there's 3 reasons. One is they don't have the knowledge. Number 2 is they don't have the skill. And number 3 is they don't have the motivation/discipline. And those are the 3 factors that I found that pretty much inhibit people in life and keep them in their socioeconomic sphere. And so let me share with you some of the parameters, and then I'm also going to go into the solution. What I found to be a highly successful way of breaking out of patterns and going to higher levels in life, and it doesn't matter if it's financially, socially, relationships, it doesn't matter, because we're talking about human beings is what we're really talking about here. So the first acknowledgement that we want to acknowledge is the 4 stages of awareness, and that's a knowledge or skill set. And that's the unconscious incompetence phase, when you don't even know what you don't know, to the conscious incompetence, to the conscious competence, to the unconscious competence. And the importance of knowing, being aware of that, is most people, when they're not even aware of what they don't know, that's what I consider to be the absolute worst place to be in, because you don't know what action steps to take. And therefore, your likelihood of breaking out of your routine or your cycle, in other words, your results, whatever those results are, whether it's failure, divorce, whatever category you want to talk about, they perpetuate themselves. So if you're not even aware that if you're in a state of unconscious incompetence, you have a slim to no chance of breaking out of your reality, of your socioeconomic structure. So we're going to pay particular attention to that and what it takes to get through each of these phases. And it's real important to understand the natural barriers. Let's face it, that if you naturally had the knowledge and skill level to run a Fortune 500 company, in all likelihood, that's what you'd be doing right now. So wherever you're at in life right now is pretty much your knowledge and skill level. Whatever results you're getting is pretty much your knowledge and skill level of where you're at. Whether you want to accept that or not, that's another dynamic. So we're going to kind of revisit that here as we kind of bring them all together. And then the second area is the motivation factor. And we talked about that really in 2 separate categories. One was, your purpose in life. And we talked about the different reasons why you'll do stuff, from a very low motivating reason to a very high motivating reason, which is called a sense of duty or purpose. And so we talked about the lowest motivation is money. And we correlate this with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the science of psychology and human behavior, and why people do what they do. And so when we talk about the motivation part of it, we'll talk about the different degrees of motivation relative to whether if you're in a pain or pleasure-based motivation state. And actually, those can be very naturally good things, but at the same time, they can be overwhelmingly strong obstacles. And if you're not even aware of it, then you'll have natural obstacles that are just constantly holding you back, and you won't have the system or the structure to overcome them. And I see that very often also. So when we talk about purpose, we were just a reminder that the lowest reason you can do things is for money. That's the lowest reason. But when you're in survival, money is very important when you're in survival or security to get out of that high motivation state. And so we talked about personal gain. People will do after money. People do things for personal gain. And that's a very weak reason too. That's for narcissistic and egocentric. Those are very weak reasons. They won't overcome very many obstacles. And then we talked about the importance of conviction. And then that's a much higher reason why you will do something. And then the ultimate reason of why you will do something is a sense of duty. And that's whether it's your God or your country or your child, things of that nature. Let's face it, you'll do a lot more for your child than you will for $100. And that's just an example of the relationship of why you would do something maybe for money versus duty. And we talked about the two different ways of getting conviction. It's either a personal emotional experience, either yourself or a loved one, or you study it over time. So you can go up. So even if you're not at a high level of purpose, you can move up on the purpose ladder. And there's very few people that achieve things at a high level and sustain them at a high level that don't have a purpose. If it's typically just for the money or just for personal gain, typically those people don't do real well, and they don't do real for long periods of time. And they certainly generally don't do a lot more for humanity. So these are some factors. So when you have a really good, strong sense of conviction and purpose, man, I tell you, there's not a whole lot that can stop you when you add some of these other factors in that we're going to talk about. So motivation from the purpose standpoint. The other parts of the motivation category that I break down are what I call internal, external, and circumstantial. And those are really huge to understand. And we're going to talk about how you can captivate some of these, how you can get through them. But also, all of this is to have a formula to break through and get to another level. But at the same time, what's way more important than the formula to break through and get to another level is be completely aware of what's inhibiting you. And that's probably 90% of the I'd say easily 90, 95, 97% of the equation to getting ahead is the subconscious or the unconscious incompetence and subconscious barriers that you're not even aware of. So, paying a lot of attention to those, a lot of times if you just eliminate those will take you up to a certain degree just because they're limiting and holding you back. So that's usually the very first place to start are barriers. It's not really to get ahead, it's look at barriers. And then the second thing that I talk about, I call it the circle of fear. And I'll explain it in detail, but it's the single greatest factor that I personally have found that inhibit individuals in life. And I call it the circle of fear. And I'm going to explain that in somewhat detail. And it's very much a subconscious, unconscious incompetence. You don't even know it's happening. And I'd say that that's probably the largest single factor of inhibition and growth in any category of life. It doesn't matter if it's relationships, finances, running a business, whatever category you talk about. And I call it the circle of fear. And so I'm going to basically talk about why you have a tremendous amount of natural forces working against you that you may not even be aware of. You're probably not even aware of. So if you're not even aware of them and you don't even know, how to overcome that, that's when you just constantly get bombarded and things just will always inhibit you and limit you. And that's pretty much what happens in life. In other words, most people just don't live through life, grow up, get out of survival and security, go through security, go through materialism, self-actualization, conviction and duty, and have great relationships and retire multimillionaires. That is not what naturally happens. There are natural dynamics that occur, and I'm going to take a few minutes to cover those. And most of those natural dynamics are to remain status quo. And there's a tremendous amount of forces that are working to keep you at status quo. And I'm going to cover that just a little bit. And then I'm going to go into the 7 steps, that I found to break through those barriers and go to another level. And again, we're talking specifically about a chiropractic business today, but these are human factors. So they, they apply to if you want to learn how to play the guitar, if you want to learn how to ski, in other words, anything perceptual you do as a human being is what we're talking about right now. So as we move through this, remember we're talking about really the three major factors that I found are knowledge, skill, and motivation. Those are really the three factors, that I found that really inhibit people. So let me just kind of go into each of these a little bit in detail, a little bit more. The first one that I want to go into a little bit is remember we're talking about skill, knowledge, and motivation. And the first one is the stages of awareness from the unconscious incompetence phase. And as I've said before, I think that's absolutely the worst phase to be in when you don't even know what you don't know, because you don't know what steps to do to change anything. And so your actions stay the same, your thoughts stay the same, your actions stay the same, and therefore your results stay the same. And next thing you know, it's 30 years later. And of course, I'll go into the typical cycle that happens mentally, psychologically, how you get broken down. The system actually breaks you down and you don't even know it. A lot of times the system will break you down and you don't even know you're being broke down. So if you're at least aware of it, you can kind of stop from being broke down. So the unconscious incompetence. And so the next stage is the conscious incompetence. In other words, now you know what you know. Now you know what you don't know. And to get from that one phase to the next is typically books, seminars, and tapes. That's typically what does it, is books, seminars, and tapes. That will take you typically from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. So you can read a book. Does that mean that I now have the skill? Does that mean I could have the knowledge? Yes. But does that mean I have the skill level? No, not at all. So you can have the knowledge and absolutely have no skill level. In other words, no ability to perform or do that function to give you your end results. So the conscious incompetence phase, the book, seminars, and tapes take you from one to the next, and they're very effective, generally speaking, taking you from one to the next. And then the next phase is whatever skill set you're trying to learn or do to go to another level of life is the conscious competence, is going from conscious incompetence. In other words, you don't know how to do it, but you know it's a reality. You know it can be done, but you don't have the skill set particularly to do it. And to the stage of conscious competence. Now, the stage of conscious competence we're going to define as kind of like riding a bike. When you start to learn how to ride a bike. And when you start to learn how to ride a bike, you got to constantly look at the bike. You're not looking at the road and, in other words, you're not controlling the bike as a part of your anatomy like you kind of learn later when you're riding a bike. And so that's kind of how I explain conscious competence, is that you can do it, you're not real good at it, whatever that task is or chore or whatever skill set, whatever it is. You're not real good at it. You can do it, but you're not real good at it, and you don't get high rewards. So there's not tremendous rewards. That's the conscious competence phase. And then the unconscious competence phase is when you just know it. And that's when if you're thinking about the bike again, that's when you can just ride the bike. And the bike's just a part of now it's just an extension of you. You don't even have to think about the bike. Now you're dodging around trees, jumping over drainage ditches. That's the unconscious phase. So those are the phases, and every part of business is like that. Remember, when we talk about business, there's 7 categories in a business, from the CEO function, the financial function, the human resources function, the service function, to the technical function, to the marketing function. There's 7 major categories that you have to be aware of in a business, and then the 4 different categories to maximize a profit in a business, which is know how to get business, number 1. Number 2 is how to keep business. Number 3 is how to deal with overhead. Number 4 is how to deal with fees. So those are the 4 categories in maximizing your profit margin for your exchange of time for money in a business. Well, everybody's at different degrees of consciousness in their knowledge in every one of those categories. And depending on where you're at, and typically your weakest link will inhibit you. That's typically what will happen. So, that's the other reason paying a lot of attention to your weakest link is real important. So what's really important about this, these stages of awareness? Here's what I've learned. Is book, seminars, and tapes will take you from the first to the second phase, unconscious incompetence. Now, the state from the stage of conscious incompetence to conscious competence, that is the stage where easily over 97% of the people fail in any activity, and that stage I attribute to most people leading very average to below average, mediocre lives in different categories, whatever, relationships, finance, business, job, whatever category you want to choose. And I'll share with you why. And being highly aware of this helps to overcome it. So if you're, number one, if you're aware of how it naturally inhibits you, you can actually form a strategy of how not to be inhibited naturally. And you have to remember, we're talking about major forces here. And what are those forces called? They're called the laws of thermodynamics. That's what they're called. Natural laws. So we're talking about really human motivation, and we're talking about being aware of not only what steps to do to move forward, but being highly aware of factors that will naturally inhibit you. And like I said, even if you don't have steps to go forward, if you're just aware of factors that will inhibit you and eliminate some of those, that alone will take you to another level. But I will tell you this, that even if you have steps going forward and yet you still have in place things that will inhibit you, then that becomes a real problem. That the potential for growth in that is very, very, very small. So we want to pay a lot of attention to inhibiting factors. And so we're talking about the stages of awareness and some of the factors it takes to get through the stages. And so I told you there's one category we're going to come back and visit because I see it as absolutely the largest inhibiting factor in life. And I'm going to go over what that is and what I did to acknowledge it and what I did to attack it. And I still attack it every day. I use the same formula I have for the last 20 years since I've learned this. So we're at the conscious competence phase. So when your knowledge or skill level goes from unconscious incompetence to conscious competence to or unconscious competence to conscious incompetence to conscious competence, we said that's kind of like you still have to think about what you're doing. And then obviously the level you want to be and in whatever it is that you want to do, preferably, if it's running a business, a chiropractic business, or a component of your business, is the unconscious competence level. And hopefully you're at the unconscious competence level at the four major categories of running a business, which is getting new business, retention, overhead, and fees. And of those four major categories, you're in the top one or two of those major categories in an unconscious competence level. That's really, really important to be there to increase your likelihood of success. So that's kind of how we break that up. Now, I want to go into this specifically for a second. And here's what happens through natural human perception is it's not that big of a deal to have a paradigm. And remember, we talk about the importance of paradigms because when we have sensory input, audio, visual, any sensory input that is a significant different paradigm than our present paradigm, it causes natural reactions. And so the other important factor to remember is natural laws of natural reactions. Well, one of the natural laws of high paradigm shifts is your defenses go up, resistance goes up, your trust goes down, and your confidence goes down. So being highly aware of these dynamics is very important to overcoming them. And these are the things that inhibit a tremendous amount of people. So when we're talking about the stages of awareness, and most of the time when you go from a stage of unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, most subjects, it's usually not that hard to do. You can read a book, you go to seminar tape, you can spend a little time or money in a particular category, to go from one stage to the next if you have any type of desire at all. That's not usually too big of a deal, you know, unless you're just really stubborn, a know-it-all, or no motivation, or things like that. The real problem, and then let me skip to the next one because I need to spend some time into the real problem. The real problem, so going from conscious competence to unconscious competence, I personally have found that's not a big issue also. And typically what happens, you're not dealing with a lot of fears and inhibitions. In other words, you know how to ride the bike, and there's not a lot of negative feedback. There's still negative feedback riding a bike. You're still afraid you're going to fall, you're going to fall over or run into something. But you're doing it. You're getting positive feedback. You're getting positive results. So you see that there's an end to this. You can see that, yeah, one day I'm going to be able to ride this bike and not be afraid to fall over or run into a ditch. And so when you're in a stage of conscious competence with any particular activity, it's way easier to get to the next level, the unconscious competence level. And usually that just occurs through what I call repetition with monitoring. And so I'm just going to leave that for now because I want to spend a little time going into the most difficult part. And the most difficult part is, and I'm going to apply this to business, like let's say it's getting new business or retention, something really important to a small business owner. And let's say they don't know how to do that. Let's say they don't know how to get new business. Let's say they don't know marketing. Let's say they don't know publicity. They don't know advertising. They don't know sales. They don't know motivation, demographics, psychographics, geographics, pain, pleasure, motivation. Let's say they don't know those things. Well, that's when you get pounded by market forces. And that's a bad place to be. So what happens when you go from that conscious competence, when you go from that conscious and competence phase, when you know what you don't know, but you want the end result. See, knowing it doesn't give you the end result. Knowing about it doesn't give you the end result. Having the knowledge and then the skill to do it gives you the end result. And then the degree of the end result, it depends on your conscious competence level or unconscious competence level. The degree of the feedback you get. And so here is what happens psychologically, what I found to be the absolute number one major inhibiting factor of a human being in life. In every category of life, whether it's business, relationships, finances, you can pick any of the category, entertainment, adventure, pick any category you want. See if this does not apply. And what happens is, and we'll kind of just walk through the process. What happens is first there becomes a thought. You think of something. You're either introduced it, you see it, you think of it, etc. And then from that thought, there becomes a feeling. Remember, we are emotional animals, and that we'll act emotionally and then justify cognitively. I mean, look how much different this world would be if everybody just did the right thing, if everybody just did the just thing. I mean, it'd be like night and day. No, but we got all the emotions to deal with, and what guides the emotions? That's what's important. What guides these emotions? So what happens is we have this thought. Now that thought could have happened from a book, seminar, or tape, or a mentor. Could have happened from any of those. And then it creates a feeling. And let me just kind of walk through. Now, typically what happens is after the feeling, there's the action, and then the action creates a result. And that's the cycle. And we all know that is the cycle of learning. And what I found is, the book, seminars, and tapes and all that is pretty easy to get to the thought process, to go from the unconscious incompetence to the conscious incompetence, to now know what you don't know, but see that there's something else that's possible. So now here's the big problem. And I already talked about the action step. When somebody's they're in a state of conscious competence, to get to a state of unconscious competence, in other words, succeed at a high level, they're doing the action, they're getting feedback, they see that there's an end result, they're getting positive feedback, it overcomes the negative feedback, and they typically will get a result. And the more of the result that they get, the more they'll do until that result starts diminishing their motivation. And then that kind of douses that flame. But here's really where the problem occurs, right here. It's going from that conscious incompetence phase, when you know what you don't know, so you have the knowledge but no skill set, and going from there to the conscious competence phase. And here's what happens is, and we're going to apply this directly to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So remember, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the first human need is the physiological needs of survival. That's when you will spend all your time and energy: food, shelter, sex, oxygen. That's where you'll want those first. Nothing else will matter. After that, then now these are individual, and they're societal, and they're cultural. And then after then you want security, emotional security, physical security. That's where you'll spend your time. Those are pain-based motivations. And then after that, the pain significantly diminishes. You would agree with me that, if you were out of survival and you had food, oxygen, and shelter, and you had security, that motivation would naturally go down if we just compared those factors. And that's exactly what happens in society and people at large. Typically, when they get out of survival and security, that's when motivation just goes away. And that's a major issue of going to another level. But here's the major inhibitory factor is when you have that feeling, so that you get the thought, whatever that skill set is, and then it creates a feeling. That the very first thing that you'll typically do is go into rejection. You'll go into why it won't work. You won't go into, yes, it will. Now, if you have high motivation behind you to push you through it, you will. But I'm talking if there's not high motivation and things are just status quo, you're in a state of homeostasis. And what will typically happen when you hear or see something new or different than what you're used to doing, then you'll typically mentally go into the no position. You can either go into the no, yes, or to the ambivalent. And 97% of the time, people will go into the no position, why they can't do it. Why they can't do it. Now, they typically never blame themselves. They'll typically blame everything about them. The most common things that I hear with when I'm training and working with doctors is, I don't have the time. And time is never the issue. It's always your skill set and your knowledge in leveraging time. That's what the issue is. It's never enough time. An example that I always say is, the homeless man has just as many minutes in a day as the billionaire. The billionaire just has much more knowledge and skill and way more leverage skill. In other words, leverage of time skills. That's the only difference. The exact same amount of time. So time is not the issue in either one of those person's lives. How one person deals with time versus the other means a huge difference in the outcome of their life. But that is typically one of the number one mistakes that I hear with doctors. I don't have time. So what happens, the first thing that takes you out of the game when you're in a state of homeostasis, in other words, there's not high motivating forces of survival or security, is you'll go into a no category. And here's why. Remember how strong the motivation of survival is? Well, go ahead and have your oxygen cut off and see how fast you get motivated. Go ahead and have your food cut off and see how fast you get motivated. So these are very high motivating factors. Same with security. Well, security is a very high motivating factor. Now, it becomes a double-edged sword. The security that you want, the psychological security, the physical security that you want, that stability to go into a state of homeostasis, that awe state, the awe state. So you don't have to do more, you don't have to do less. You're in a state of homeostasis. You don't have to expend energy. These are laws of thermodynamics. So what happens is you will naturally say no because now you're fighting the very thing that you fought to get which was security. So now once you have security, emotional, psychological, physical, remember there's many types of security, then that motivating force to a human organism becomes the thing that now inhibits you. In other words, there's a tremendous force that inhibits you that's based on security now. Now, that when you don't have security, it's a tremendous drive to get you to act and do something. When you do have homeostasis and get to a certain point, that becomes a tremendous force for you not to do anything. And it plays out in society. And that's why when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and you look at societies and cultures, the vast bulk of the society, based on Pareto's 80-20% rule, is right at the below security, just above security level. That's where over 53% of the population is. They're not in the third or fourth level of Maslow hierarchy of needs, and the majority of them are not in survival. And I'm talking about the U.S. culture. And so there's a tremendous inhibiting factor. And so most people don't realize how powerful the sense of security and we call that fear of the unknown. Well, what is fear of the unknown? That's security. That's you challenging your security in something that you don't know, are not familiar with, or a paradigm that you may or may not know, or a thought process you may or may not know. So you have so the very first round. So remember, if you're doing everything the same, the results stay the same. If your thoughts stay the same, your actions stay the same, feeling stays the same, your actions stay the same, no change in the end result. So we have to break a thought pattern. But that's not the end of the game. Matter of fact, that's not going to do it. If we just gave you the information, remember, that just takes you from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. Basically now, you know what you don't know, but you don't have the skill levels to do anything about it. So, and that's very, very, very common. I mean, how many people go to seminars and they learn a lot, never do much with it? Or if they do, they don't do as much as they could with it. And I've often said when I've trained people that, I give a lot of information and a lot of detailed information. And I don't think I've had one doctor go over 30% of the information that I gave. And these are the factors why. The number one overwhelming factor is you're challenging your own sense of security. So the very first thing, and we call that the fear of the unknown. So the very first thing you'll do is you'll go into the no position. How many times in life do we hear something different than what our perceptions and paradigms are, that immediately we go into the no position? Remember, that's if we're in a state of equilibrium. If we're in survival security, we won't go into the no. We'll challenge it. So this is very important to know where you're at on this curve, so you know what to do, what actions to do, and how to overcome some of these natural, very strong inhibitory factors. So that's the typically thing that happens first. When you're in a state of homeostasis, you'll just go no. Now, the most common thing that'll happen is you'll never blame yourself. You'll never say, I can't do that. You'll never say, I'm weak, I'm strong, I'm the problem, or I'm weak, I'm the problem. That's what you will hardly ever say, but it's the best thing you could say. Most of the time, you will blame the external environment. You will blame the external environment because that now allows you to stay secure. So when you see or hear something different or more, when you go into the no category, it allows you to stay secure. And then when you're not doing that activity, making as much money, living a better lifestyle, having a better relationship, whatever that is, then what's the natural human dynamic that occurs? Does the person say to themselves, I'm unconscious incompetent with that skill set? No, that's never what they say. Here's what they say. They degrade the other person. He must have cheated, lied, or stealed. It's never your weakness that you will put on the table. And you can't do that. You have to be very strong to be able to do that. And it takes a lot of strength to do that, but it is one of the best things you can do. But typically the weak people will blame other things, number one. But here's the bad part about that, is you don't try again. You've just justified your status in life. Every time you blame something and somebody else, you've just solidified your end result in life. And most people have no idea that that's what they're doing. So that's typically what happens on the first go around mentally. Now, what happens if you try it remember, there's different motivating factors I'll get into in just a second. But let's say you're motivated. Let's say you're in survival or security. You hear a different concept, a paradigm, whatever, and you now are willing to challenge your security, your unfamiliarity. You're willing to challenge it to take your knowledge and skill level to the conscious competence level to try to create a different end result. Well, what happens with that is now you may try it. Now, you need to be aware of some statistics. 50% of the people, 97% of the time, you won't even try something if you're in a state of homeostasis. And you'll go into denial and blame other people and other things. And now you're solidifying your future. And then what also happens, the second level to that is you'll try it, but because you're not experienced with it, you get a tremendous amount of feedback. And an example of that, like if you're in business, if you're trying to do, get new business, and you learn, let's say you learn the exact techniques of exactly what motivates people to come in and get new business, but you're not going to have the skill level there. See, you're going to be in a state of conscious incompetence. You're not going to be in a state of unconscious incompetence, but you don't know that. And so typically what will happen is you'll venture to do it. Now, it depends on your motivation again, but again, we're taking away survival, motivation, and security. We're just saying you're in a state of homeostasis. First thought process, you'll just go knowing into denial. Second thought process, if you attempt an action, you'll be very bad at it because you don't have the skill set. You don't have the knowledge and skill set yet. And because you're really bad at it, you're going to get high negative feedback. When I was in starting Little League Baseball and I wasn't very good and I tried to bat and throw the ball and all that, I was terrible. I wanted to quit. And the only reason I didn't quit is the motivation behind me was my father with high motivation not allowing me to quit because, he knew I'd quit on my life. I was setting the stage for my life and how I thought about life and the challenges of life. So what happens typically is when people go to the next level and they actually attempt it, there's tremendous negative feedback. And 97% of the time, people quit right there. So look at the numbers. If you're in a state of homeostasis and you're wanting to learn a new skills level to change an end result, look at the odds that are against you. Number one, you're going to resist it, number one, mentally, because it's going to challenge your security. Unfamiliarity. We've all heard of fear of the unknown. Fear, that's what that is, fear of the unknown. It's challenging your security. Let's face it, if you weren't afraid of the unknown, how many things in life would you be doing right now that you're not presently doing if you didn't have security fear issues? It would be ungodly what you'd be doing and accomplishing in life if you didn't have these tremendous inhibitory. Remember, these are survival mechanisms. These same mechanisms keep you alive. They keep you from not getting hit on the road. So, there's a balance here. Number one, it keeps you alive, but the second part of that is it really inhibits you from a higher quality of life. So, the first thing that you'll say is go no. And I said about 97% of the people will just say no right away. Go, you don't believe me? Go ask your relatives. Go ask your relatives that are not in a high motivation state. Give them books, seminars, and tapes on how to do something and come back a month later and see if anything's been done about it. Nothing. They didn't even attempt it, probably. So 97% of the people won't even attempt it and won't even do it the first time around. So that takes out a massive amount of people. And then the next round that takes out the next massive amount of people is the high negative feedback. Let's face it, we don't like to have a ton of high negative feedback and persist. So what will make us persist? Well, I'm going to go into that, but if you're in survival, you'll persist past high negative feedback. And do it again and do repeats until you start getting some positive feedback. But you better have some strong drive behind you or a system in place. In other words, if you're not familiar with this is just what naturally happens. You don't know what you're not doing. You hear a concept or idea about running your business, whether it's new patients, retention, whatever, If the paradigm shift is too much from what you know, you'll shut it down and turn it out. No end result. That won't change an end result on your behalf. If you do try it, most of the time you won't. And then if you do try it, you'll typically fail. You'll fail because you're not good at it. Just like anything else we do that we're not good. Go ahead and try to hit a golf ball and try to hit a hole in one. And you never hit one. It's going to be hard. You're not going to do very well at it. There's going to be high negative. And so now there becomes a lot of other issues with ego and pride and all that. And so that takes out a tremendous amount of people. So if we look at those two categories alone, you're at over 99.95% of the people who never get to the next level in a category after, remember, that's after they're in a state of homeostasis. If there's high motivation in survival or security, it will drive you to do more things. The problem becomes, once that motivation isn't there, how to overcome that to have a more successful relationship, business, finances, whatever it is in life category, adventure, whatever it is you're pursuing, spirituality, whatever category you're pursuing. So that becomes, and so, you know, just in those dynamics alone, people quit. So people quit on life. They quit on life through natural, high dynamic forces of security. And it happens going from the conscious incompetence phase to the conscious competence phase. Now, because of that, you need to be highly aware of what are some steps to overcome that. Number one, the paradigm shift, the fear of rejection, and the fear of high negative feedback. Are there some steps you can take to implement to get through that phase with not as much trauma? Yes, there are. We're going to go into that tonight. And I'll share with you some examples of when I trained doctors of what I did. I'll show you exactly how I was able to take doctors through those phases. So, matter of fact, let me just do that right now. So, in knowing this, I knew when I trained doctors that I knew that they had to know how to get new patients. I knew they had to have retention. I knew they had to deal with overhead, and they had to do with fees. I knew that they had to do that, and they had to do it at least a conscious competence level before I could invest with them and open an office or do anything, or I was going to head for failure. So what I did is I put in multiple systems in place to overcome all this high negativity. And this is what I did. The first thing I did is I put them in the worst case scenario. I made them succeed in the worst case scenario because nothing will get worse than that. And if they could succeed in the worst case scenario, I knew that I could send them to any place on planet Earth and they would be a successful chiropractor because everything would be better. And let me define what I'm saying better. So as an example with retention, I would put them into what's called cold calls. I would put them out in front of people that didn't know them. They didn't know them. The people didn't know them. No trust. They didn't know if there was any need. And I put them in front of those people to get them to a presentation, an educational presentation. Well, that's not easy to do. Go ahead. Now, if you're in survival, it's a lot easier to go out into a mall and do a screening or do a lecture. You know, there's a lot of motivation. But once you're not there, you won't have the motivation to do that unless you have some other things in place. And so you won't get through that skill set. Now, this also applies with, let's say, an employee you're training. This is exactly the method that I used with training employees, training doctors. This is exactly, I'm highly aware and plugged into this. So what I did is multiple things. I'm highly aware of fear of the unknown and the 4 stages of awareness and skill set. So I would take one specific skill set. Let's say that skill set is getting new patients. And I'd put them into a cold call market, no trust, number one. But I did a couple other things that were really important. The first thing I did is I taught them. So I explained the how and the why. And everybody has to know the why or they won't last. Even if they do something, they won't last. They'll stop doing it. So that's why I always teach the why. first. So first you go from the unconscious incompetence to the conscious incompetence. That's books, seminars, and tapes, and that's the why. Now that doesn't bring a skill set. That just brings an understanding of the possibility is all that does. So I took them through that phase first. Now I knew the next phase is where life was going to kick them in the butt. So I did multiple things. Here's what I did. I did huge baby steps. Very, very, very small paradigm shifts. So I took the training of getting a new patient and I broke it down into multiple, very small steps. And I did that to help psychologically overcome the fear of rejection, as well as increase a skill set. And I'll give you a simple example. One of the first things I would have them do is introduce themselves. Remember, we're talking about somebody's fears. And I would have them introduce themselves to somebody they didn't know. And it would typically be the cashier at the grocery store. It would be the cashier at the gas station or whatever they did, where the fast food restaurant. And so I got them to start being comfortable communicating. So the first thing that I did is I got them to get comfortable with talking to people they didn't know. That's the first thing I did. Now remember, I wanted them to be in the worst environment. So I wanted to put them in environments with people they didn't know and there was no trust and no need. I did that on purpose. So when they went to their practice and they actually started having patients, friends, and families and all that, it was way easier. In other words, I didn't want them to leave practice and run into anything harder than what they'd already overcome in a knowledge and skill set when I was training. And that's why I had a 77% success rate and I never had an office go out and fail. That's why. Because they didn't fail before they left. They were successful before they left. And they were successful in the core components of running a chiropractic business, or any business, which is getting business and retention. And they were successful at it in the worst category. That's why nobody failed. Because they were trained in a state of unconscious competence. In other words, if they didn't know how to do it in a state of unconscious competence, I didn't open them up. That's how simple it is. Whether it's training an office member, an insurance girl, a desk, how to answer the phone, how to talk money or time to a patient. I took them through all of these stages exactly the same way. And I was highly aware of that second stage that kills people. And so here's some of the steps I did is I broke it down. I put them in the worst case environment. I broke it down into baby steps. So the first thing that I had them do is had them go introduce themselves when they were paying for their gas and introduce themselves and say their name and that they were a local chiropractor and shut up. They were not allowed to do anything else. That's it. And I had them do that with repetition because remember what we know about learning is that we have to, when we talk about learning, we have to use sensory and motor to increase the learning and the skill set. We use sensory and motor and repetition. If we just use sensory, it's not going to be as effective. When we use motor, remember, sensory is like 30% learning, motor is like 55% learning. So when we do sensory and motor, now we have 80-85% potential learning, and then we do repetition. And what's the importance of repetition? The importance of repetition is it takes 21 days. You guys have heard it takes 21 days for a habit to form. Well, the reason for that is there's a physiological reason. That's how long it takes for the neural filament to form. So we want to form the neural filament within that category. So we also decreased rejection. I totally eliminated any rejection potential because that's one of the major factors that stops people from moving forward is when they do too much too soon and get rejected, then they get defensive and blame everything and everybody else. And for all practical purposes, their life's over. They are solidifying their socioeconomic status. And they don't realize. I think if they knew that they were solidifying their socioeconomic status, most people would stop blaming everything else. But I think they still think, by blaming everything else, it's a natural phenomenon because it protects your security. But they also think that, yeah, I'll be able to do it later or whatever. And I'm like, no, the more you do that, the less you're going to be able to change anything in your life. So these are major, major concepts in getting from one stage to the next, in training and developing and evolving and changing a result, and especially in business. Doesn't matter what category. I mean, this applies to skiing and playing a guitar. Go ahead and try to play a whole song on your first night, and you're going to break your guitar and throw it against the wall. So I'm going to use a lot of these psychological techniques to move. And this is called training. This is called coaching. This is high awareness. Now, I do this to myself. I still use these exact procedures today. The difference is I don't have near the fears I did 20, 30 years ago, because I understand how it all works. And I already know I'm going to break all these things down into their incremental parts and attack them one by one. I'm going to use pleasure and pain motivation. I'm going to use all of these multiple factors, sensory, motor, repetition, all of these factors I use to whatever it is I want to do in life to go to that next level. So here we are at using an example. So look at the multiple things that I did to help them get through this category, to get to the conscious competence phase. That's the whole goal. Because when we get from there, it's way easier to get to the unconscious competence. So what did I do? I took away the negative feedback, or I minimized the heck out of it. How did I do that? Broke it down into really, really small steps. Role playing. They had to do a lot of role playing. They had to do role playing without notes, because that's when they were going to be the worst case scenario in front of somebody live. So role playing with a friend or a colleague is a tremendous training tactic to get somebody through the conscious competence phase, incompetence to the conscious competence. You use baby steps, take out the negative feedback. You're using repetition. It's sensory and motor. This is how I was able to do it. And this is what you're going to have to pay attention to wherever you're lacking in your skill set and your knowledge, or you won't make it. You're going to have too big of a paradigm shift, too much negative influences, and the only way you'll bust through that is if you're in a tremendous amount of pain, to force you to endure to get through it. So these are techniques and strategies in every category of your business: new patients, retention, finances, overhead, every training, staff, every category I break them down into these categories like this. And this is how I'm able to overcome significant obstacles that are just bury the masses of people. And that's how I was able to become the largest chiropractic provider in the nation. So some of the other examples is I talked about no negative feedback, introductions. And then after I had them introduce themselves to a certain amount of people and say they were a chiropractor, they weren't allowed to do anything. It didn't matter what the person said. If the person said, I want to come in for an appointment today, I want to pay you $500, they were not allowed to take the patient. You have to take away the potential of negative feedback, because it's at this stage of the game, it's not about the result. At this stage of the game, it's about the skill set. Because if you get the skill set, the result will happen. If you never get the skill set, you'll never get the result. So you have to be highly aware to not pay attention to the result during this stage of the game. And that tempts too many people. I've seen too many people that don't understand this. They jump too fast, too far, huge negative feedback, bombed, squashed, over, just like that. So it's not about the end result. It's about the sequence. I'm only trying to get to conscious competence. I don't care about the result right now. It's the sequence. So those are some ways that I did that. And so we'll share with you some other ways as we move along, some of these strategies. And they're very important strategies. And these are the strategies we're going to have to put in place to get you to where you want to be. We're going to have to use a lot of these techniques and a lot of this psychology and a lot of these strategies to get from that conscious incompetence, because it's real easy to listen to all these tapes and watch all these videos and go, man, that's a lot of stuff. Man, Paul knows a lot of stuff, and I'm glad now I know a lot of stuff. And then you have absolutely no skill set to do it, meaning you haven't changed your life one bit. Now that would be sad. So we're gonna pay a lot of attention to that. So let me move past that. I just wanted to really pay a tremendous amount of attention into the high imperative of security and having a framework to overcome this huge subconscious, unconscious inhibition. It's huge. It is, and that's why I call it the number one factor that keeps people normal and doesn't allow them to achieve. I personally believe most people have tremendous abilities. I think 99% of the people never tap into the massive amount of talent and ability potential they have. And the number one reason is what I just discussed. So going to the next subject is we talk about motivation. So the first thing we talked about was you have to have a purpose. If you're just doing it for the money, it's not going to last. If it's for narcissism, the sports car, the big house, it's just not going to last. If there's a sense of conviction and duty there, that will take you through a lot of the obstacles, because there will be a lot of obstacles, whatever you're trying to break through in life. Whether it's building a chiropractic practice, training a insurance staff member, playing the guitar, learning how to ski. There's a lot of obstacles. So the second category that we talked about was the 4 stages of awareness and the relationship to them, and especially putting a tremendous amount of emphasis in that second to the third phase, the conscious incompetence to the conscious competence, and how your natural drive of security will inhibit the heck out of you. And if you're not aware of it, and if you don't understand some really basic strategic plans, you're just always going to be inhibited. And for the most part, you're probably going to be blaming everybody else for your mediocre life. And, there's enough people like this on this planet that blame everything and everybody else. And so hopefully you rise above that. And these are the strategies of how you can do it. And so the next factor I want to go into is the motivational factor, or your drive. And I want to talk about 3 categories in that. One is the internal motivation, external, and the circumstantial motivation. And again, if you're in a high motivation category, remember, once you get out of that pain motivation of survival and security, motivation just kind of goes by the wayside significantly. It varies a little bit. Maybe you live in a little bigger house, a little nicer car, and that's it. Most people in the society at large, especially in the United States, they kind of peak out right in that curve right there, right in that middle area. And so how can we control motivation? Well, what if you knew some of the basic secrets of motivation and you had some strategies to apply? Maybe would that be significantly important for whatever it is you were going to do in your life? Yeah, it'd be huge. And so I'll just share with you what those factors are that I've learned, and how maybe a story or two of how I apply them in my life. But the first thing is, let's talk about the 3 different types of motivation. So the first and the weakest form of motivation is what I call external motivation. And the example of that is like books, seminars, and tapes, and families and friends. That's very weak. I mean, we've all read a book, been motivated for 24 hours, no more than 48, and then that's it. We've all been there. And so been to a seminar, excited, days and days after the seminar, nothing gets done, nothing happens, nothing changes. It's 6 months later and nothing's changed. We've all been there. And that's very weak form of motivation. So you have to recognize what is weaker and what is stronger, so you can tap into this. Instead of being just ignorant, just being totally ignorant, and let market forces just beat the heck out of you, and you just kind of be pretty darn average to below average. You just have to be aware of some of these factors, and you have to strategically use them in your life. So external motivation. So that's one motivation. The next one I talk about, it's a little longer term, is the circumstantial motivation. And those things that happen over a longer period of time. And some of the ones are like if you have a brand new baby, well, being responsible for a brand new baby, that's motivating. That's survival motivating, taking care of somebody else. You buy a new home, especially if the new home is you bought a little bit too large for your pocketbook. Well, that's motivating. That's circumstantial motivating. Say your kids go to college, there's more cost incurred, or you want your kids to go to private school. There's more cost incurred. Well, and these are short term. Short term could be a few years, a few months to a few years. It's not a lifetime deal. And or your circle, if you have a circle of influence who's in a pain situation. So if you have a mother, father, brother, sister who's, has a health related problem, or they're in their down and outs, or lost their job, or lost their home, somebody you care about, those are going to be what I call more moderate term circumstantial motivation. Divorce, you'll lose because you're going to lose half your assets right there. Divorce is probably the number one reason for not being a millionaire. And it's true, the first $250,000 are the hardest to make. The knowledge to do it, because once you have it, you have the knowledge and you have the money to leverage. But if you never make the first $250,000, chances are you never gain the knowledge and you don't have the money to leverage it. And so divorce is a tremendous inhibitory factor to wealth accumulation. And of course, bankruptcy, all of those are short-term motivating factors, or what I call circumstantial. Now, they're important, they're important. We're going to pay attention to them. But none of them trumps, none of those two trump what I call internal motivation. And internal motivation is what I call the pain thermometer. And essentially, that's how you're imprinted as a child. And I give the analogy that every person is imprinted as a child. And I kind of use some analogies like a thermometer. In other words, we all don't come out of all of our households, as seniors in high school, and everybody has, an 80-degree motivation. It doesn't work that way. Some people are at 100, 120 degrees. Some people are at 40. And I've put together a list of what I found through research that affects internal motivation. And so what I found to be factors that, and remember, internal motivation is long term. That's who you are. That's imprinting. That's who you are. Now, the good and bad news about that is, and this is one of the reasons people think, people keep making more and more money or whatever, they don't understand it's not about the money. It's about there's a tremendous purpose in that person's life, number one, but also that their pain thermometer is set so much higher that they're running and doing things at a much higher pace when somebody else would have already given up because they're satisfied. And that's called internal pain. I call that the pain internal thermometer. I call it the internal pain thermometer. I haven't read it. That's just what I call it. That's just from experience, from training and studying and dealing with a lot of people. This is what I found. And these are some of the factors that I found to be influential. First of all, is the socioeconomics of the family. That's typically why wealth goes through 3 generations. It's well known wealth goes through 3 generations. Why? The first generation are the immigrants that are in survival, that bust their butt. They have to have a good work ethic to make some money to survive, and they want it better for their kids, so they pay for their kids for their education and to do more. So their kids typically have a good education and a good work ethic, and they do significantly. They typically become the white collar of the family. And then typically they give their kids way too much, and then their kids typically become the couch potatoes and lose the money because they don't have the work ethic or the knowledge. And it's well known, it's very documented that wealth goes through 3 generations. So number 2 is a factor that I fact is when did you first start working? And a lot of this is dictated by your home life. And most of this is the pain of home. I call it the pain of home. And it's not physical pain of home. It's psychological, emotional pain of home. And so when did you first start working? Well, most of that has to do with when did you have to start working? Well, typically, if you've had to start working at a younger age, you were imprinted higher. So there's a higher chance of pain-based internal motivation. And again, I'm being general, but these generalities are pretty good from what I've experienced. An example might be somebody who, didn't have to, their parents did well socioeconomically. They didn't have to get a job when they were a young kid. All they had to do was go to school. Didn't have to get a job while they were in, high school. maybe got their parents paid for their first car, and they didn't have to go to work when they went to college, and their parents paid for their college. Well, you can almost guarantee that person has some very low internal motivation, internal drive, because the pain thermometer was set so low. And remember, the pain is what motivates. 80% of what we do is the survival pain, to get away from that. So if it's not there, it's not being set. And you'll typically see this with high performance people when you start reading biographies and people that do exceptionally well in life. And then you go into their biography and read into their life as a childhood. Almost everybody has some serious pain that created this tremendous drive. Another factor is, when did you buy your first car, or did you buy it? These are factors that I've learned. So, if you didn't have to buy your first car, that's not a pain-based motivation. These are things that imprint you as when you're being raised. And again, did you work during high school or college? Did you have to pay for your own? Did you have to pay for your own college? Your birth order. What's interesting when you look at birth order is, every man that's walked on the moon, from what I read, is a firstborn, and it kind of makes sense. And usually comedians are lastborn, and it makes sense as long as his kids are relatively together. And it makes sense, the lastborn's always trying to get a lot of attention. The firstborn is always being pushed a lot and so they're typically a little bit more of a leader. Well, these things, they leave impressions, and we are formed not just by our DNA, but our environment from the womb, all the way through. So we're constantly being influenced by all these factors, not just DNA. So I talked about personality. Certain personalities have natural tendencies for certain occupations, whether it's a chiropractor, whether it's an accountant, whether it's somebody working at the Ford assembly line. There's certain personalities that naturally have greater tendencies to being self-employed. I talked about that. I found sports, and it's not just sports, but if there's I found people that participate in youth sports and all that, it pushes competition. People, they're used to doing more. They're used to trying more. They're used to being more. They're used to having goals. And so, there's a pretty big difference if you're not pushed in sports in junior high school and allowed to sit on the couch and watch TV all day, and how that imprints you. In other words, it's making you hardwired. You're developing as this is happening. This is who you become. Now, you can always change it and move in directions, but it takes awareness, knowledge, and you can go in any direction you want. So I found sports, especially with people with individual sports, like wrestling and debating. In other words, where there are individual challenges as opposed to a team sport like football, baseball, basketball. Those people really work great with people in teams. But the individual sports people are not only challenged, but it's self-challenging. It's no longer a team. They win or lose based on themselves in that mat out in the middle of that wrestling floor. So these are factors that I've seen that affect motivation, internal, what I call the pain thermometer. Whether you did extracurricular activities, and just the socioeconomics of your home. Homes that are dysfunctional. Of course, we use that word so much, all homes are dysfunctional, but, if you didn't get a lot of love or recognition, appreciation, or support as a child, that imprints you into what you either like or don't like, and what you're motivated by or what you're afraid of. And I see this routinely with the doctors that I coach and train. I'll give you a couple examples. One of the doctors that I trained that did very, very well, she went bankrupt out of school, opening her own practice. And after we took her through the training course, her first year in practice, she collected over $700,000. And the short of her history is she had high pain imprinting. She had a mother that was a drug addict, her father that was never home. He was an alcoholic and a workaholic. She came from a tremendous pain. So her pain thermometer was through the roof. And how much she, now instead of turning to negative things to destroy her life, she turned that energy into good things. She became the valedictorian, and she paid a lot of attention because that gave her a lot. That's what gave her a lot of positive feedback, was the accolades of that type of activity. And so that she had a tremendous amount of internal pain. And that's called drive. That's called motivation. And everybody has different degrees. I mean, another example is one of my friends is he's an only child. And so his parents gave him everything. He never had to work through school. He was given everything. He wasn't pushed very much to do very much. His parents were afraid for him to do very much because he was the only child, so he didn't get to challenge himself very much. He was given his own car. His college was paid for. And we've sat down many times and talked about he's a very, very low achiever. I mean, you can't do a whole lot, to put a fire under his butt. His pain thermometer is so low. It was set so low by his parents by giving him such huge security and not having him challenge himself. So his idea of normal is way below, way below what most people are, consider normal. These are just some examples. These are meaningful examples. And so you need to be aware of them in your life, and maybe how to use them in your life, and more importantly is be aware of what's inhibiting you. A lot of times these things can be inhibiting factors, and I'll share with you some examples of that also.